Okay, now that we're done with the 10th Doctor era, thank God, now we enter the 11th Doctor era with Stephen Moffat at the helm. I am extremely excited, but extremely scared at the same time. But hey, let's go. First, we get into the bad stories with number 39, and that is Nightmare in Silver. Neil Gaiman's second contribution to the Doctor Who universe, and it is so disappointing. Now, anybody who knows Gaiman, even on a surface level idea of him, and are a Doctor Who fan, knows that he is a massive fan of the show. He's been watching it ever since The Daleks, as in the original story from 1964. So if any famous British person who is a writer knows Doctor Who more than anybody, it's him. This was prevalent in The Doctor's Wife, and we will get into that, but that is a long time away. So, what am I getting at with this? Well, seeing this episode and watching it unfold, it feels like someone who skimmed the Tardis fandom wiki wrote this fucking episode. That is how horrible the continuity is. The Cybermen do not act like Cybermen at all. They act like generic alien cyborgs with their multitude of new powers. The ability to detach limbs, super speed, all that shit. I feel like I'm watching a Doctor Who episode written by J.J. Abrams. What in the fuck happened? Well, apparently Moffat wanted to make the Cybermen scary aliens again after the only Cybermen we saw were human cyborgs from a parallel Earth. Fine, I get that, but this was not the way to do it. They wanted to play with upgrading, but I feel that they went too far and the Cybermen were barely recognizable anymore. It's a shame because the new look is fucking amazing and one of the best New Who revival designs we've gotten, period. They actually look like Cybermen and not the stupid clunky looking motherfuckers we got before. The story is nonsensical, the military characters are all two-dimensional, and while Smith did get to display his acting chops, it's played off as way too goofy and kinda cringy at times. This was also a really fine example of Clara not having a clear-cut character. She's this militaristic type that's barking orders at people, talking faster than normal, and almost acting like a robot herself. It perfectly shows how she's a chameleon character, where her personality changes with the episode and who's writing her. She definitely feels like a Gaiman character, but like a parody of one, and it's not good. Warwick Davis is fantastic here, and it's yet another magnificent talent that is wasted on these mediocre episodes, and we'll get to more of them soon enough. The kids are ungodly fucking annoying. I honestly wanted to strangle Angie for half this fucking episode. She's one of the worst characters of the new series, easily, as well as the fact that they must have said the phrase spare parts like 15 times throughout the episode. We get it, it's the supposedly greatest Cybermen story of all time. Stop fucking saying it, sheesh. If I had to say anything good about it, is that it does feel like a Gaiman story at times with some dialogue and some quirks here and there. The new Cybermen design is fucking amazing. The Cyberplanner Doctor can be menacing at points, but it's unfortunately few and far between, and Warwick Davis is great. That's about it. It's honestly an episode that gets worse the more I think about it. Next is number 38 with The Name of the Doctor. This is an episode that feels like Act 1 of a story, which is fine since it's the first part of the Doctor trilogy, but on its own, it's not very good. It's nice to see River again, and this time a post-Silence in the Library version, which is a cool idea. The Great Intelligence was nice to see. It has some cool moments here and there. That's honestly kinda it. It's kinda bland and forgettable. Great Intelligence is easily beaten, so there goes that great actor and character once again, and the fulfillment of Clara's mystery box crap was a cool idea on paper, but in execution just feels kinda lazy. Like, oh, she just stepped into the Doctor's timeline and poof, she became splintered throughout his timeline and saved him. She can sometimes live a life, sometimes not. He can see her sometimes not. It just feels really fucking stupid when it's clear Moffat put little effort into this series because he was busy with Sherlock. I literally just watched this episode and have already forgotten most of it. We get more Paternoster Gang, which makes me want to blow my fucking brains out as well. It's just a bad fucking episode with little to add and feels almost superfluous. Now we shall get into the lousy stories with number 37, The Bells of St. John. This is another one of those wasted potential sort of stories. Here we have the Great Intelligence trying to gather people's minds or something, as well as starting the Clara arc for this series. Again, it's just so boring and bland that I have just nothing to say. Moffat's era is filled to the brim with great ideas and faulty execution. This could have been an intriguing social commentary on the internet dividing us, and I did find some similarities to the Japanese film Pulse, even including a plane crashing. But it doesn't do anything with those ideas. It's more or less have this greater story idea with people getting killed through Wi-Fi instead of adding any sort of depth to it. It's just, Great Intelligence is the bad guy, we have to stop him. That's it, and it's really boring and forgettable. We have our introduction to Shitty Clara as well, so shit episode indeed. Now we have number 36 with Asylum of the Daleks. This was a cool premise that was pretty much thrown away because of how filled to the brim it is with stupid. So in this episode we get reintroduced to Amy and Rory, and they want to get divorced because, well, the plot demands it. Instead of building upon that through their time before they leave, it's pretty much fixed in this episode. Just added drama that makes little sense to add for the sake of adding drama. Then we have the idea of an Asylum of the Daleks. While a cool idea on paper, it kind of makes little sense when you actually think about it for more than a second. Daleks are all about being the greatest and most superior race in the universe. Why in the ever-loving fuck would they have an asylum filled with Daleks that don't work or measure up to their expectations of a Dalek? It makes no sense. As I watched a review of this episode a long time ago, somebody mentioned that it would make way more sense for it to be an asylum of Cybermen, full of half conversions, or people with technological bits on, or people without an emotional inhibitor chip. That would make sense and be really fucking cool. Plus, with the actual Cybermen story we got this series in Nightmare in Silver, which sucked, the aim for that was to make the Cybermen scary again, which it failed at. This could have been a terrific scary Cybermen episode filled with great body horror aspects, but we didn't. With all that said though, is the plot of what we got good? Not really. Osmond Oswald is a good supporting character and a lot of fun, but it would have also made more sense to make her a Cyberman instead of a Dalek. The human/Dalek hybrids are again a cool idea, but don't make sense. Which also leads me to believe that this would be yet another cool idea if this were a Cybermen episode, by making them semi-converted human slaves, but not full Cybermen. The actual asylum is a decent setting and kinda creepy, but the story of the episode just falls so flat that I lost interest extremely quickly. I did like it more than I initially did, as when I first watched it I hated it because the premise was cool but the episode sucked. However, it's not as bad as I remember it being. It's still a boring and generic episode, but it's not bad. Just makes little sense, has some added drama for the sake of drama, is generic and flat, and while Oswin was a good character, she was snipped too early. So with that, it was a lousy story. Next are the mediocre stories with number 35, Let's Kill Hitler. This is an episode that purely exists as setup for the series finale and payoff for build-up that doesn't fucking exist. You have Riversong, like her or not, being an integral character to the Doctor Who mythos. Her origin and who she is just shoehorned into this episode as an afterthought. It's like Moffat had this intricate plan to have this character enter the Doctor's life being huge lore-wise, and he simply forgot to put in the build-up to this mind-bending revelation of the melody that Amy and Rory knew as their friend to the melody that is their daughter. Like, that is such a huge oversight that it reaches almost jaw-droppingly hilarious levels of stupidity. On top of that, the Tesselecta purely exists in this episode to set up the finale. That's it. The Tesselecta barely does anything of note except try to kill River, and we know that doesn't work out, so they are pretty much pointless here except for setup later on. Then the story in and of itself is just mediocre. It purely exists for Moffat to shove all this lore down our throats to get it out of the way to do other shit later on. The reason it's mediocre, and not worse, is that Matt Smith is always a delight, the Tesselecta is a cool idea, and some good one-liners and moments from Melody. Outside of that, this just doesn't work as an episode. Now we have number 34, The Rings of Akatan. Before I rewatched this, I was looking at the episode list, and I legitimately did not remember a single thing about this episode, and I had no idea what it was about or what was contained in the episode, the sequence of events, and the villain, and what have you. When I did rewatch it, about a day after doing so, I pretty much felt the same way. Just so forgettable. The effects are pretty, like the CGI and the alien makeup, the little girl is a decent enough actor, and I like the Susan reference. But outside of that, it's nothing all that special. Clara isn't too bad in this episode though, so there is that. Next is number 33, Dinosaurs on a Spaceship. This was yet another episode that I originally really hated, but have since made peace with it. This episode is a stupid, silly, and idiotic episode, but it's kind of aware it actually is. Its intention wasn't to be a good episode, just a silly and stupid episode that revolves around its idiotic title. Unlike Asylum with the Daleks, where its intention was to be a good episode and failed, here they simply had a stupid premise and ran with it. I do sort of wish that it was focused more on the Silurian aspect rather than the aftermath, but with the aftermath we get some of Smith's darker aspects to his character that I always appreciate. David Bradley as Solomon was a great villain, and it's sad to see him get stuck in such a mediocre episode and see Bradley's talents getting wasted. There is also a lot of cringy jokes and dialogue, mainly with the Nefertiti character and the game hunter whose name I don't remember. Rupert Graves is yet another name wasted, in addition to Mitchell and Webb as the idiotic robots, although Mark Williams as Brian Williams was quite good. I also didn't totally hate what the Doctor did to Solomon, because while dark, it does fit in with his character since Solomon did commit genocide against the tribe of Silurians, so leaving him to die makes sense. Overall, it's not a good episode by any means, at least the intention wasn't that it was supposed to be good. Just a dumb light episode with some highlights that are very few and far between. Now we have number 32, The Crimson Horror. This is one of those episodes where it has somewhat of an intriguing idea but just falls flat. We have yet another appearance of the Paternoster gang, which makes me constantly roll my eyes with the cringy ass jokes and overall annoyance of being there. While there is a decent mystery of what happened to the Doctor halfway through the episode, we get all of the answers, so there goes that. Then Clara is just more of a waste of space here and doesn't do anything of note except get kidnapped. I will say Diana Rigg is having an absolute fucking ball with the role, and she was definitely one of the few enjoyable parts of the episode. The actual Crimson Horror is kind of a cool idea, I guess, and the actual plan of Riggs' character was intriguing, but it's just not a very interesting episode and too many stupid things that prevent it from being better. Next up is number 31, Closing Time. An extremely mediocre Cybermen story with some decent moments. Craig returns after his appearance in The Lodger, and while he's not as terrible as James Corden nowadays, some of that annoyingness does kind of leak through in this episode. I mean, pretty much everyone on planet Earth hates James Corden because he's an asshole and unbearably annoying, but before all of that, getting his own show and whatnot, he's actually competent both here and in the earlier episode of The Lodger, but we'll get to that later. The Cybermen feel like next to no threat here, and they seem genuinely forced as the villain in this episode. With this, it's painfully mediocre. The only things I really like was the setting, some of the stuff with Craig and the Doctor, and the jokes with Alfie, even if they are pretty corny. Everything outside of that wasn't terribly interesting. Amy and Rory didn't need to be in this episode for like 5 seconds, although they might have had to be if it was a contractual obligation, but most of the episode is just kind of generic and forgettable, and the Cybermen once again getting little respect in the new series. Next up is number 30, The Day of the Doctor. It's sad to put this so low, but in reality, it's really not that good. It's perfectly serviceable, but that's not what an anniversary special should be, especially not the 50th. Now, I am on the side of people who think that this special ruined the Ninth Doctor's development as a character. The thing that was so great about 9 is that he was a well-rounded character. The Doctor never really was that, with maybe the exception of the first. He's not there to develop, he's there to be a mysterious figure that takes us on various adventures of fun. But Russell T Davies made the Ninth Doctor a real character who was horrified by war and this decision he made, and I feel Moffat ruined that by making Gallifrey live. I am a bit more at peace with the idea of another Doctor pushing the button, as I originally hated the idea of the Warrior, but considering it's the same character, it's fine. John Hurt does a magnificent job, like he always does, but it just feels a bit weird to have John Hurt, one of the greatest actors who has ever lived, play the quirky alien on a niche sci-fi show. It just feels not real. That's not on him, but there were rumors that BBC wanted a famous name to pull people in, and it certainly worked. It's sad that Christopher Eccleston couldn't appear, but it is understandable with how horribly he was treated, and there were further rumors that Eccleston thought the script was terrible and didn't do his Doctor justice, which is fair. This was kind of just a mediocre Doctor Who episode that also manages to celebrate 50 years of the show, which is kind of heartbreaking. When I originally saw it, I was just confused and had a lot of disdain for it. While I have made peace with a lot of aspects, I simply cannot forgive the injustice made to the Ninth Doctor, as well as the fact that the mysteriousness of the Time War is taken away. It was like this horrifying war beyond words that went across galaxies and time, and was too epic for even the word war. But in this special, it's just Diet 2029 from the Terminator franchise. Just imagine the opening scene of Terminator 2, but with worse effects, and that's the Time War that was showcased, which kinda sucks. Other attributes that weren't great were the Zygons. They weren't there to do anything of interest either. The Zygons are only there to keep the Time War plot going along and are literally forgotten about once they serve their purpose. The scene with all of the Doctors moving Gallifrey into the pocket universe was just so dumb and cheesy that I couldn't help but smile. There should have been more moments like that, but then it would have actually felt like an anniversary special. Even though the moment in and of itself makes no sense, since the Daleks would not be stupid enough to just keep shooting with nothing to shoot at, and then just kill themselves. Overall, outside of the fact it barely feels like an anniversary special and ruins the Ninth Doctor's character arc, it's honestly a pretty mediocre story. The actual Time War plot is fun at times, but shouldn't have been the 50th anniversary special because it's a New Who story. This should have been in 2015 and been a 10th anniversary of New Who, not an all-encompassing Doctor Who story. The only thing we get in terms of an actual anniversary feel is the scene with the archive footage and the cameo from Tom Baker. I mean, I love Tom Baker, but having him and not any of the other Doctors just feels like a slap in the face to the older fans, and to the classic Doctors. I get it might alienate newer fans, but fuck them, this is the 50th anniversary special, with 50 years worth of fucking fans. You can't please everyone, yes, but at least make a fucking attempt to do so. In terms of other specials that are attributed to the 50th celebration, I'd watch An Adventure in Space and Time and Night of the Doctor, or listen to Light at the End, because those feel more respectable to Doctor Who as a franchise than this did. Next is number 29, The Power of Three. Another Chibnall episode, yay. This was a decent premise and was almost a decent episode, but the climax kind of ruins it. The idea of a slow invasion was intriguing, and seeing the life of the Ponds without the Doctor was interesting, as well as him being a part of their boring life. The humor wasn't as cringy as Dinosaurs and had some good moments. The climax, as I said, really ruins it, considering the villain was a generic "I need to wipe out humanity because they're pests" type that we've seen before, as well as the ending being pretty much a Moffat happy ending with everyone coming back to life and the cubes not being a problem anymore. It's just a quick and easy solution with no consequences, and it just comes off as really lazy. So while the episode before the climax is decent, it does majorly fail with that extremely lazy climax. Next is number 28, Hyde. Another episode I completely forgot about until I watched it. This one is a bit more memorable than Rings of Akatan, as it is higher, but it still really falls flat. It starts off as the scary episode of the series, but it goes downhill because it's not at all scary, and really all that interesting in the second half of the episode. I do like Dougray Scott and Jessica Raine in their roles, as well as their chemistry, and the idea of the time traveler being stuck in a pocket universe is a unique idea. But it does somewhat take away from that idea of this being this scary episode because it isn't scary. I know that it's extremely subjective, but I just don't think it worked for me personally. And this is my list, right? Anyway, the ending of the monsters being in love was fucking stupid as well, and pretty much took away any goodwill this episode had. which was not really all that much to begin with. But outside of that, it has some unique ideas strung throughout that almost makes this a decent episode, but many things fail it, like the second half not being all that interesting, the idea of the monsters being in love, as well as the episode just stopping dead in its tracks. Now for the decent stories with number 27, A Good Man Goes to War. This one is decent because at least the adventure is kind of fun and it has some good revelations, but for the most part it's just kind of decent because it was pretty much all for naught, not terribly interesting, and pretty forgettable. You have some decent action, some pretty good setup, and some interesting tidbits along the way. I do like how Rory is showcased as the hero by Amy. I felt that was a great build-up and good payoff. Unfortunately, the Paternoster gang makes their first appearance here, and while they aren't as annoying as later appearances, I do very much hate the fact that their inception was in this episode, because fuck the Paternoster gang, as I have mentioned several times before. This one is usually detested by fans, and you can see why, because it's just pretty boring and forgettable. Not a lot to say, so moving on, I guess. Now we have number 26. The Snowmen. More wasted potential. Sad days. Wasting a great villain, wasting 2 great actors, and wasting a better companion than the one we got. But it is a Christmas special, so it is a bit more forgivable than most. However, that only goes so far when the villain of the episode is the Great Intelligence as an evil snow globe voiced by Ian McKellen. While the snowmen themselves are a pretty cool effect, the villain doesn't feel interesting or threatening like he was in classic Who stories. Dr. Simeon, played by Richard E. Grant, is good, but again, he does little of interest. While he does get expanded upon with later appearances, they still aren't that great. No pun intended. Then we finally have the Victorian barmaid / governess version of Clara, who is a trillion times better than the Clara we got. She has good energy, good characterization, is witty, funny, likable, and has an actual personality. Yet, due to Moffat's mystery box crap, we had to get some overly big mystery in regards to Clara, as well as yet another modern companion. But I already talked about all of that. This episode, while fun, as it's a Christmas episode, the episode in question is a bit distracting because there is so much wasted potential here, like the Doctor's development after being unable to save Amy and Rory, his darker aspects, and his costume and personality in this story. The Artful Dodger, I believe Moffat called it. I like it, and it works here. However, outside of that, decent episode, but wasted potential. Next up is number 25, The Angels Take Manhattan. This is a very weirdly paced episode. I feel like this episode was meant to be a 2-parter, but then it got cut down to 1 episode. Like there was constant setup for something else to happen, but then in the last 5 minutes, everything kind of just gets wrapped up in a little bow. I would have liked to see this as a 2-parter since it is Gillen and Darville's last regular appearance. The Weeping Angels feel like an afterthought in this story as well, and they don't feel like a threat, similar to their first appearance. Like it was more so about Rory and Amy, which is fine, but I wish the Angels, who are a fan-favorite villain, got a bit more love this episode. I will say, I do like the opening and the gumshoe vibe it has. Only thing that was really dumb was the Statue of Liberty being a weeping angel. That just took it too far. Which is even more hilarious considering I didn't know until writing this that Moffat actually implemented a fan theory that stated that. Which is a big no-no unless you plan to implement it from the beginning and fans were just smart. Riversong is utilized well in this episode, the human villain is a bit forgettable, and overall it's fine, but I feel like there could have been more. Next is number 24, The Doctor, the Widow, and the Wardrobe, a pretty forgettable Christmas special that had a touch of heart that prevented it from being worse. The character of Madge was good and overall likable, even if a bit strange at times. The kids were also decent actors, the girl better than the boy. I feel like the girl was a good companion to the Doctor and characterized well. Androzani gets name-dropped and the comedians that were used were fine, even if the dialogue was a bit cringy. The ending is what made this a slightly better score than what I would have given to it otherwise. It had a nice, sweet Christmas energy that I appreciated. Outside of that, though, it's a decent little adventure, even if pretty forgettable. Now we have number 23, Journey to the Center of the Tardis. This was so close to being a really good episode. So close, but it just ends up being kind of bland and the ending fucking kills it as well. So this is purely a TARDIS episode. 99% of it takes place in the TARDIS. With a new set, that sounds fucking awesome. I don't really care for the new set, but it still could have been fun to see them going through this new TARDIS to try and find Clara, or something way more interesting. But alas, it isn't. The three side characters of the junk traders aren't really that interesting, and the added drama of the one brother not technically being a robot with the other two brothers pranking him with that because they're bored? Like, what? What the fuck was up with that? We do get some really good experimental ideas of the TARDIS, and I do like that, with getting closer and closer to the center, seeing all the rooms and weird quirks of the TARDIS, while also finally seeing the Eye of Harmony in a proper way. The setting and the ideas that stem from that are really cool, it's just everything else fucking blows, as well as the fact that they make it so it never happens. We have the Doctor and Clara's relationship developing, and the brothers learning that it's not okay to trick their brother into thinking he's a fucking robot, even if that subplot was really fucking weird. But then that all just gets magically erased in a nice big happy ending. In terms of Clara, it just gets pushed until a later episode, and with the brothers, there is hope that they will eventually become better. But the fact that it got erased to begin with was ridiculous, because I hate it when stories just magically erase everything and we get no consequences. But despite this, it does have a lot of interesting ideas when it comes to the TARDIS, and that does save it from being a total train wreck. Next is number 22, The Time of the Doctor. A good era ends with a whimper. Well, the entire series was a whimper, but this just clinches it. After the incredibly mediocre Day of the Doctor, we get a slightly better but not all that great Regeneration story. Considering 10's Regeneration story, you could only go up from there, which this one kinda did. It wrapped up everything that Moffat set up since the 11th hour, albeit rather sloppily. It came across as rather confusing and not really making a ton of sense. How the crack in time feeds into the Time Lords surviving, even though it was already paid off, as well as changing the rules as to what's behind the crack, just came off as Moffat speeding through answers so that he could just tell the rest of the story. You had one-liners explaining this and that, and I feel like I'm trying to absorb information for a test, but none of it is getting retained. The story of Eleventh's final battle on Trenzalore isn't a bad one because I feel as though it's all-encompassing as to what makes the Doctor who he is. It's kind of interesting and kind of fun at points, but it feels like it's doing too much. It's a regeneration story while also answering all the questions of the Smith era while also paying off the 50th. It's just a bit much. It shouldn't have done the crack in time stuff and possibly whittled down some other plot points to make it a bit simpler. It's still fine, but it was a bit much at times. Then we have the regeneration, which is a bit odd. How it has this big overly dramatic one and then a reset and then he changes his face? That's a bit weird and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. His speech wasn't really wholly necessary, but I do admire it, considering that Eleventh's acceptance of regenerating is a hell of a lot better than Mr. Vanity from fucking before. I'll always remember when the Doctor was me is a hell of a lot better than I don't want to go by a fucking mile. So while I don't love his regeneration and how weirdly paced it was, I'll give it a pass since this is something that he's accepting and has done a bunch of times before, rather than it being a shock that he changed his face. So, enjoyable special, has some major flaws, but is overall fine for what it is. Next is number 21, A Town Called Mercy. I was kind of surprised with how much I liked this episode. I remember not liking it very much the first time I watched it, but I thought it was pretty good. Again, like with a lot of these episodes, the climax kind of loses me, but outside of that, I thought it was pretty good. I liked the Doctor interacting with, well, the Doctor, aka Collar Jex. I think it was an intriguing way to bring about his darker aspects in regards to the Time War, and while Collar Jex was needling him about the actions of war, you can really see the anguish and can understand the actions the Doctor does afterwards because of that. It shows why the Doctor can't be alone for too long and why his companions are so important, which is also showcased very well in the David Tennant specials with the whole Time Lord Victorious nonsense. Here there is a bit too much telling and not showing, so that is a major qualm there. The main reason I couldn't take this episode so seriously is the fucking discount Terminator. It's just so ridiculous that it almost breaks the episode. Luckily, it does try to focus more on the actual town, hence the name, the Doctor's character, and a companion's relationship to the Doctor, as well as the ideas and themes of war. It could have been done a lot better, don't get me wrong, but considering the rest of Series 7, this is a silver nugget, and I'll take it as is. Next one is number 20, The Wedding of Riversong. Again, this one is decent because it does have some interesting ideas and some good setup. I do like the idea of changing this gigantic fixed point in time, and it's so massive that all of time is happening at once, and people are none the wiser. That's actually kind of cool and pretty interesting. I do wish that there were more experimental and surreal elements, since I feel like those ideas are taken as far as they can possibly go. But it is just background for the rest of the episode, which is kind of fair. The rest of the episode is perfectly serviceable, and a good adventure with trying to get time back to what it was before and have the Doctor actually die. It's a ticking clock story, but the urgency is never really felt throughout most of the episode, unfortunately. So it does kind of fail at that. But the threat of the silence is once again finally felt and showcased pretty well. Madame Kavarian is still a despicable villain, even if she is one of the weaker villains to come out of the new series. Overall, while it does have some good ideas and some good story beats and is pretty inventive and creative, it feels like yet another Moffat-style ending of it being all for naught and not having consequences. Number 19, The Hungry Earth / Cold Blood. If it wasn't for this story, Series 5 would have been near perfect, but this is pretty much the only blip on the golden age of New Who. And the end of time, but we don't talk about that. The only reason that this is decent and not mediocre is because the first episode is good. Not great, but it's good. It has good build-up, good intrigue, good mystery, all that shit. It doesn't have totally stupid and awful crap until the next episode. The mother is an ungodly, annoying character, and if it wasn't for her, this episode would have gone fine, in terms of both the situation at hand and the quality. But because this woman is a complete and utter dumb fuck, everything went into the shitter. They try to make her sympathetic, like, oh, I did this for my family, I'm not evil, yet you still ruined the attempt with peace talks with the Silurians, you still forced your father into destroying the Silurian city, and you still murdered somebody. Well, yes, the latter was an accident. It was an act that destroyed everything, and what I got from it is that she didn't feel any remorse for her actions, as well as the fact that the Silurian scientist got away scot-free with dissecting someone without anesthetic, even having the Doctor tell him that he wishes there were more people like him. Like, I'm sorry, what? So while the first episode is pretty good with setting up everything, the second pretty much shits on it all, despite having some highlights here and there, and some decent ideas. Also, Chibnall completely misunderstood the idea of the Kraken time as well, but let's not get into that. Now we have number 18, Night Terrors. This was an episode I remember liking more, but it ultimately kind of falls flat. Keep repeating myself. I like the creepy living dolls and Amy and Rory being in a gigantic dollhouse. I do like the creepier aspects of this episode, but outside of those things, it does kind of become forgettable. However, it's decent because the stuff with George and his dad and where that ends up is pretty sweet, but I feel as though there isn't enough bite to it. There isn't enough memorability or intrigue. It's just that this kid is afraid and wants to be loved. It's nice and wholesome, and I appreciate that. But the fact that the creepy dolls were a really cool aspect of the episode, I do wish they were showcased more or in a better episode or utilized better. It's not bad, and there are quite a few good moments. I just feel it doesn't have a lot of plot for its running time, as well as some ideas not being utilized well. Next is number 17, The Rebel Flesh / The Almost People. This was a concept that just kind of fell flat despite a great first episode. The first episode had some intriguing aspects, is mysterious, and is overall a good story with some radical ideas when it comes to the gangers versus the humans. I feel as though the second episode makes those ideas kind of fall flat, and the racism / prejudice commentary is really in your face and kind of preachy. The main plot for the majority of it is pretty good. The subplot with Rory and Jennifer is kind of weird because it's never fully explored as to why Rory would become so close to Jennifer. It's just kind of a sob story that has Rory do ridiculous things for the rest of the story to help Jennifer. Although I will say that her turn is pretty good development, or regression I should say. Amy is weirdly very prejudiced in this episode. I get it, but I don't think it should have been so aggressive. I get that it was all part of the twist that comes later, but I'll get to that in a bit. So while the first episode was suspenseful and intriguing, the second episode kind of falls flat, with character actions being ridiculous, the turn of bad to good for the gangers is sloppy and rushed, and it kind of becoming less and less interesting, as well as the fact we have that famous cliffhanger, which is revealed that Amy was a flesh avatar the whole time. Good twist, but it overshadows the rest of the story, as well as the fact that the Doctor was trying to champion the rights for the gangers, yet kills one no problem. While it was more of an avatar for Amy rather than it gaining sentience, it still is a bit off considering what the Doctor was trying to do throughout the story. Decent story, but falls flat in many areas. Now we have the very good stories with number 16, The Impossible Astronaut / Day of the Moon. A pretty good story in regards to good old-fashioned teasing that Moffat loves to do, but has a good story surrounding it. The Silents are a decent addition to Doctor Who lore. They're probably one of the better New Who villains, or at least one of the more memorable ones. Ironic. I'm kinda indifferent towards them. They're not amazing, but they're kinda just fine. Perfectly good with what the intention is and are good in the episode they are featured. I just don't have any major attachments like other New Who villains like the Child or the Midnight Entity. The first episode and the second are relatively the same quality. I don't really like the time skip in the second episode, but it starts to get going again after that initial jolt, especially after the cliffhanger of the first episode. In terms of the setting, this was the first major Doctor Who episode to be filmed in America, and using the space race, a very American achievement, was incorporated very well, I think. It has some fun aspects, some good creepy moments. Mark Sheppard as Canton Delaware III was awesome, as Sheppard usually is. The guy who played Nixon was also pretty good. Overall, while it's more so known for setting things up for later in the series, it still has a relatively good and fun story surrounding it, with plenty of good moments and some good guest appearances. Number 15, Victory of the Daleks. This one could have been improved if the Dalek disguise went on a little bit further. It's a good story and a good callback to Power of the Daleks, where the Daleks disguise themselves as helpers to the humans. But Power of the Daleks was a 6-part serial where it had room to properly build up the Daleks to the threat they are, while also introducing a new Doctor. Here it's just 45 minutes. With that, the story does kind of suffer. It's still good, but I do wish the idea of the Daleks being helpers were drawn out a little bit longer and there was a bit more of a build to it. Mainly because I feel as though there was a lot of lollygagging in the latter half of the episode in regards to the Dalek threat. It definitely would have been better if the first half was the Daleks in disguise and the second half was trying to defeat them. But with that, it's still a very good episode because I do really like the setting of World War II and the idea of a disguised Dalek. Even though it wasn't executed that well, it was still a well-done idea, as well as the idea of the Daleks and the Doctor technically winning in this episode. Both of them. I also like how dark the Doctor gets in this episode. People seem to forget how dark he can be. While on the surface he is goofy and a dork and that sort of thing, he is still dealing with the fallout of the Time War. While it's not as noticeable as 9 and 10, he still has that with him, and I feel as though that it was well integrated. So, while this episode could have been a lot better, the idea of the disguised Dalek, Eleventh's character, the fun action side of it, Winston Churchill being Winston Churchill, and its ideas make this a very good episode. It could have been better, but for what it's worth, it's very good. Also, the new Paradigm Daleks aren't that bad looking. Now it's time for number 14, The Beast Below. A pretty simple episode that has an intriguing mystery and brings about a moral question towards the end of it. It has some good side characters like Liz, Ten, and Mandy, as well as the Doctor having some good chemistry with Amy. While the actual end of the episode is pretty anticlimactic, I think the idea of the Doctor lobotomizing a creature, essentially mercy killing it, was an interesting idea and a good moral question. However, not enough time with it was a noticeable flaw, as it could have been more interesting if more time had been paid attention to it. I do also like the small bit of world building that it brought, and it referencing classic Who with the solar flares. Overall, while not an extremely great episode by any means, I like what was done. A great mystery, great chemistry between Amy and Eleven, some good side characters, decent world building, and a decent moral question that I wish had more time for it to be properly executed. Next up is number 13, The Curse of the Black Spot. So this episode continues with the tradition of a story featuring a historical figure with a reinvention of a classic myth. This episode features a reinvention of the classic monster of the Siren / the Mermaid, and the famous person in question, or should I say infamous, is Henry Avery, an infamous English pirate. I really like the idea of the Siren, and the look is quite simple yet effective, and the setting of a pirate ship was really cool and fun. But it was mainly due to the one location for most of the running time. I wouldn't say it was creepy, but it was an intriguing mystery with the Doctor constantly coming up with the wrong theories, which was a bit refreshing how much he actually gets wrong, as well as it being rather amusing. I also like the idea of the story with how this is all figured out and what the siren actually is. It's a simple episode, but a fun one, featuring pirates and alien AI. What more can you ask for? Next is number 12, The Vampires of Venice. A pretty damn good episode that shows the darker aspects of the Moffat era that many seem to forget. While the plot in and of itself is pretty good and interesting with the sinking of Venice, so the Saturnans could live once more. But the story involving the Doctor figuring out who is behind all of this and what had to be done, and that he has yet another dead race under his belt, was very well done. It's very subtle and only culminates in the last couple minutes of the episode, but its ideas, themes, and characterization for the 11th Doctor was very well done. As I just said, people seem to forget how dark 11 can be, and I love that aspect of his character. I also really like how this reinvents the idea of the vampire, how they have all of the attributes of vampires, but it just so happens to be an alien race. Unlike Tooth and Claw, though, where being a werewolf adds no lore to anything, here, when everything comes to light and who they are, it all makes sense. All of the attributes that we associate with vampires is reinvented here, and it works marvelously, as well as adding lore and adding to the Doctor's character rather than just being a generic alien bad guy. Also, the late great Helen McCrory doing a magnificent job as the main villain. Nothing short of superb work on her part. I thought it was quite interesting that the shtick of having a pseudo-historical that reinvents a horror icon with a historical figure was split into 2 different episodes this series. The horror icon episode being this one, and then Vincent and the Doctor being the historical figure episode. But that is for much, much later. Despite this, though, a very good and entertaining episode with some great lore and ideas buried underneath the surface. Pun intended. Now we have number 11, The God Complex. I remember this one being a bit better, but despite it being very good, the main thing about it is that it is kind of a little bit, maybe, forgettable. In some places, at least. And the Weasel guy got pretty annoying after a while. I understand that was the point of the character, but it became a bit too much at certain points. However, despite those 2 small negatives, the rest of the episode is pretty damn good. All of the characters were extremely likable and memorable, especially Rita. The location of the hotel is pretty creepy and somewhat reminiscent of The Shining. Even though the movie is hot garbage, it does remind me of that setting, and I do like that setting. The Minotaur looks great, and I do kind of wish they bit the bullet and just made him a Nyman, since I'd rather have the Nyman look as awesome as this rather than the horrendous costume from the 70s. But I thought this was a good, suspenseful, and intriguing episode with some good development for the Doctor and Amy's relationship. It certainly would have been better if Amy and Rory stopped their adventures here, as it was a good ending for them, and worked a hell of a lot better than Angels Take Manhattan. To the great stories with number 10, A Christmas Carol. This one is pretty much a fun Doctor Who take on the famous Dickens story. Michael Gambon is magnificent here, and the way the Doctor meddles in his life isn't just sunshine and rainbows either. There are serious repercussions for the Doctor meddling in someone else's life for his own needs. While those needs help save thousands of people, you are still meddling in the life of a man who doesn't necessarily want his life to be meddled with. So there are some great themes in addition to the fun story with some great emotional moments, even if the romance is a bit weird. Despite this, a great and fun story, which is what all Christmas specials should strive to be. Then we have number 9, The Girl Who Waited. Another great Amy-focused episode on her relationship with Rory as well as the Doctor, as well as being very dark and well executed. I also like how it's kind of a Doctor-light story. It has Amy, the 11th Doctor's greatest friend, actually losing faith in him and realizing that sometimes you have to fight for yourself and that the Doctor isn't always going to be there, as well as playing around with some time travel mechanics, which I always like to see from Doctor Who. While it is light on story, it is more of a character-focused episode, similar to Amy's Choice, which we will get into later. The final moments between the older Amy and Rory were heartbreaking, and the only major negative I have is that all of that development for Amy does kind of go out the window, which would then be brought up again in God Complex, as I stated. However, outside of that, this is a damn great episode. It has some good development, a good and simplistic story, Amy having some time to shine, a great setting, a good enemy with the handbots, and some good emotional moments. It has a bit of a big negative, but the rest of the story more than makes up for it. Next is number 8, The Pandorica Open / The Big Bang. I was kind of surprised by this finale because I didn't remember liking it incredibly. The first episode is mainly hit and miss because despite some good moments, it feels strangely off. Like, they find what they're looking for within, like, the first 10 minutes of the episode, and then I feel the rest of it lollygagging until the fucking thing opens, and then it's revealed to be the Doctor that gets trapped in the Pandorica. While the cameos from all the villains was kind of fun, I feel as though it was put there to get a more epic feel, as well as the name drops with who's there. Like, Moffat was forced to put them all in there after the epic finale of Stolen Earth / Journey's End. But the second episode is really where all of the great aspects of the finale come from. It has a better and more intriguing story, its ideas of time and sort of playing with that, as well as the cracks in time, were all really interesting. It has more of a fun adventure vibe to the whole thing, and everyone has impeccable chemistry with one another. It's this race against time, as well as having a touch of heart in regards to Eleven's relationship with Amy. It's a bit ridiculous and over-exaggerated at times, but it has that Moffat fairy tale whimsical quirkiness that I like about his era, despite the latter third being shit. So this was a great story, and while the first half was hit and miss, mainly because of its pacing and how they find the Pandorica so quickly, I think the story of the second half more than makes up for it with its tone and fun adventure, as well as having plenty of great character moments throughout. Now we have number 7, Cold War. The only fucking great episode of Series 7. Wow, what a fucking surprise that was. This pretty much takes every great aspect of Second Doctor stories and mimics it here with beautiful execution. First off, let's talk about the Ice Warrior. Holy fucking shit, is it fucking beautiful. Not only do we see a good classic villain return, but to see one that looks so goddamn good is really exciting. It retains all of its familiar attributes, but it properly updates them in a great way. So instead of looking like weird turtles, they actually look formidable and kinda cool. At first, seeing the redesign, I thought the armor was now silver, but I was glad to be proven wrong that it was still green, just a bit more subtle. But moving on to the actual plot, the actual episode is a great claustrophobic base under siege episode. Clara isn't that ungodly annoying in this episode, so that's good. It has a great cast in Liam Cunningham, Tobias Menzies, David Warner, and James Norton, and they all do a good job in their proper roles. I will say I didn't hate the Ice Warrior coming out of his armor, because I think it worked for just this episode. I do wish that you didn't see his face at the end and left things only to mystery, like being in the shadows or only seeing his hands. But honestly, that's a small nitpick for a great episode in such a shit series. The redesign is beautiful, the Ice Warrior is formidable, the cast is magnificent, it's actually pretty creepy at points, it's interesting, as well as having some decent social commentary about the, well, Cold War. It's a great episode, and I'm happy that Series 7 gave us something worthwhile. Next will be a bit of a controversial one, but number 6, The Time of Angels / Flesh and Stone. This one I find to be very underrated, mainly because it's in the gigantic shadow of Blink. And while Blink is a decent police procedural-esque episode with some cool horror elements, this two-parter, in my eyes, is definitely superior. I just love the epic feel in this episode, and on top of that, it's a well-executed mystery, and the Weeping Angels felt like a threat. Like, the image of an angel becomes an angel. That is fucking scary as hell, and I think Moffat properly upped the ante in the best ways possible. In Blink, as I stated, the angels never really felt like a threat. I know they're supposed to be, but when they teleported people back in time, it just felt like a minor inconvenience. Like, well, I'm in the 1920s now, oh well. There were no repercussions to those actions, you know? Here, due to the lack of temporal energy, the Weeping Angels just fucking kill you. While that may seem generic, it proves to be a scarier premise, because while horror movies and shows and episodes don't bother me, I definitely felt more scared here than I did watching Blink. I also like the idea of the church in the future having fucking soldiers. I feel as though it's a weird sort of social commentary on not only the church, but possibly the military-industrial complex. Not in your face, but subtle enough to make it noticeable. I also like the idea of Amy being slowly possessed by an angel. Very cool idea, adding to that image of an angel becoming an angel lore. The story in regards to the angels slowly taking over, the crash of the Byzantium, River subplot, the stuff with the crack in time, all of it was very well integrated, and this feels like a two-parter that is worthy of the fact that it is 2 parts. The build-up and payoff feels organic and worthwhile the entire way through. If I had to say anything bad about this story, it's the fact that you see the angels move, which does kind of take away the scariness. But it only lasts a couple seconds, and it's one of the very few bad things about the story. However, the rest of the story, for the most part, is damn good and damn underrated. Now we have the very great stories with number 5, The Lodger. Here we have a companion light episode, and it's a surprisingly great one. I was kind of dreading this one because even though I remember liking it before, it has the giant elephant in the room that is James Corden as Craig Owens. Even though I already mentioned him with Closing Time, it was more noticeable here since, I watched this one before Closing Time. I expected him in that to be not as bad, unlike here. Here, he was a genuinely decent character. He acted well, he was written well, and he was good in this episode, and better here than in Closing Time. The idea of the Doctor trying to stop a villain while also accidentally taking over this guy's life was funny, and the alien menace was actually pretty intriguing. It's definitely a filler episode, but it's a damn good filler episode. It's simple to the point, and it shows the Doctor managing to get along fine, not only by himself, but without any of his trusty gadgets, similar to the 11th Hour. Plus, I always liked the idea of the Doctor going undercover. This is just one of those episodes I can't help but enjoy and love. It might not be one of the greatest episodes ever. I majorly enjoyed it, and I think it executed its intent well enough and properly. And James Corden is decent. Who knew? Next is number 4, Amy's Choice. Another damn good filler episode that manages to expand and develop Amy's character and role in the show quite nicely. What person in her life does she love more, and who does she think is her destiny, Rory or the Doctor? Simple, yet effective. It's pretty much 2 good plots thrown into one episode, while also dealing with our characters in a proper and effective way. It gives Amy that push into proper adulthood. She had an imaginary friend, but because of him, became a somewhat angry and rotten adult. She found Rory, but obviously had doubts because the Doctor returned to her life. So there were all these ideas in regards to Amy's character that got properly fleshed out here, and how a simple choice truly fleshed out her future. This is once again a good example of a filler episode. But the reason this wins out over The Lodger is the fact that it builds upon every character in the Tardis. Obviously Amy the most out of all of them, but Rory as well, and probably the Doctor the least. As well as Toby Jones as the Dream Lord, who is fucking amazing, and I would love to see him return into a possibly more Valeyard-esque role, but it is unlikely to ever happen, and sometimes a one-off appearance is for the better. A great episode that managed to get so many things right in terms of its characters. Now we get to the amazing stories with number 3, The 11th Hour. Oh God, what can be said about this masterpiece that hasn't already? After the only other post-Regen story from New Who being lackluster at best, it could only go up from there. It perfectly jumped into Moffat's era in the best way possible and nailed the type of tone he was going for. Gone was RTD's brooding and dark character studies, not saying that was bad, and we entered an era of whimsy and fairy tale quality, as I have stated so many times throughout this video. This is an episode that has a great fast pace that doesn't let up, has a great story, a great villain, and the Doctor proving that he truly is clever by saving the planet without the use of a sonic screwdriver or his trusty Tardis, all while still wearing his predecessor's clothing. Murray Gold's bombastic new score for the show entitled I Am the Doctor is nothing short of excellent. While Prisoner Zero isn't exactly the most amazing villain ever, he is still memorable enough to make him, as well as the Atraxi somewhat, a credible threat. It manages to set up everything so well. The Doctor's persona, the tone this era is going for, Amy as a companion, and showcasing that Doctor Who has still got it. Speaking of Amy, holy fucking hell was this idea brilliant. Perceiving the Doctor's regeneration and quirkiness through the eyes of a child. That's fantastic. The comedy in the scene where Eleven is trying to find something to eat still has me laughing my ass off. Most of the comedy in the episode is actually pretty good, with a few dated jokes here and there, i.e. the kissogram and delete your internet history joke. But going back to Amy, I just love the idea of the Doctor being introduced to a child and even offering that child the idea of adventures, but only to make a permanent mark on her life, so much so that she became an angry and bitter adult, as I stated with the previous entry, resulting in the fact that there are always consequences to the Doctor's actions that sometimes don't get brought up enough. But with this, the Doctor is brought back into her life and has to reassure her of who he is and bring that whimsy back into her life again. It's such a magnificent episode, and every little story beat in detail is so well executed that it's easily the best post-Regen story of the New Who era, possibly ever. Now we have number 2, The Doctor's Wife. A good Neil Gaiman written episode, thank God. I absolutely love this episode from beginning to end, expanding on some Time Lord lore, Saran Jones being damn great as the human version of the TARDIS, and having a fun yet dark story that is drenched in Gaiman's style while also having some of his classic witty dialogue. It develops the Doctor in all the right ways, showing that darker side to 11 that many people seem to forget when it comes to him realizing that there aren't any Time Lords left. It showcases a side to him that I wish we saw more often, and showcases Smith's acting ability so damn well. This episode perfectly fits in with Moffat's more whimsical style during his tenure as showrunner, but done better than Moffat could ever achieve. Gaiman has such immense love for Classic Who, yet manages to perfectly modernize it in this episode. I feel the tone of this story definitely fits as a better 80s Doctor Who story, but its actual story feels specifically modern, mainly through the dialogue and the flirty interactions between Idris and the Doctor, as well as shining a light on the companions, but not in a huge way that makes it distracting for the main story. It showcases more of the TARDIS, not in a huge way, but enough to show that side of it, similar to the 80s era of Doctor Who, mainly the 5th era. Gaiman wrote this as a love letter to Doctor Who, even having it take place in a junkyard where this entire adventure started, and he perfectly achieves what he intended. Michael Sheen does a magnificent job as House, so much so that I didn't even realize it was him until many years after I initially watched the episode. It was nice to see an Ood, and Auntie and Uncle were creepily hilarious as well as mysterious. This is just one of those episodes that manages to get everything right. Perfect villain, perfect setup, perfect payoff, perfect dialogue, perfect writing, perfect performances, and just a damn near perfect episode. Yet there is still one episode greater than this one. Number 1, Vincent and the Doctor. The best story of the 11th Doctor era, easily. While it is somewhat more famous for its tear-jerking ending, it does have a great episode along with it. It has the Doctor noticing something wrong in one of Vincent van Gogh's paintings while at the Louvre, and going back in time to figure out what it is. The main focal point of this episode is Tony Curran's performance as Vincent van Gogh, who is near perfect in the role and has wonderful chemistry with both the Doctor and Amy. The story and alien threat on the surface can be seen as generic and not very memorable, but it's a story that is entirely allegorical and a metaphor for mental illness and depression, all through the eyes of one of the world's most misunderstood artists. It has a perfect blend of the Doctor's quirkiness, but managing to balance that out with his darker aspects and intelligence. The ending, when Vincent sees his work in the museum and the impact he made on the world, was wonderfully written and executed, and properly emotional, as well as the ending with Amy realizing it was all for naught anyway. While it is up for debate on whether or not Vincent van Gogh committed suicide, looking at new evidence, it looks like he didn't. However, despite this, what the episode did and what we knew at the time, the episode still holds true to its themes and perfectly executes them. Not bad for the writer of Love, actually. Now we get into the companions, and we start with an honorable mention, actually, who is Madge Arwell. She isn't technically a companion, but I counted her as one because she is the closest to one for Dr. Widow in the Wardrobe. She's a decent character, but she did have some good aspects to her character that worked for the episode in question. Moving on to actual companions, we have the worst companion in Clara. Not a surprise here. While she is definitely worse with 12, she still pretty much feels like a non-character. She purely exists to move an ongoing series mystery forward, and once that's over with, she's just kind of there. Depending on who the writer is, her personality changes with almost every episode to service the plot for that episode. She's really strong-willed and independent in one, fun and bouncy in another, militaristic and stern in another, quiet and reserved in another. She's a chameleon character, as I stated, only exists to surface whatever she's supposed to do in a certain episode. She's not as ball-gratingly annoying. She is certainly that later on, but here she just exists to have a mystery for the Doctor. That's it. Not relatable, not interesting, and not well written. She is therefore last. Hell, even Madge is technically better than her, but Madge doesn't technically count, so whatever. Next, we have Craig Owens. You know Clara is a bad companion when I'm rating fucking James Corden ahead of her. But with that, this was before he became extremely annoying. Here, he's quirky, funny, and weird. He's not great, but he is decent comic relief in his 2 episodes, even though only in closing time is he considered a real companion. He was better and less of a caricature in The Lodger, but with closing time, there is a bit of good comedy with him, the Doctor, and Alfie, which is one of the few good things coming from that episode. Not incredibly memorable or great, just some decent comic relief. Next is Victorian Clara. This is kind of cheating, but considering how different she and her present-day counterpart are, I said screw it and make them different. Mainly because Victorian Clara is a much better and way more interesting character. She has great chemistry with the Doctor, is quick, strong-willed, funny, charming, and an overall well-rounded character. While she only got one episode before we got into shitty Clara, she was leaps and bounds ahead of her in every way possible and way more memorable and interesting. Hell, I'll even throw in Dalek Clara because she was definitely quick-witted and fun as well, but she doesn't really count since she technically wasn't a companion at that point. But despite this, Victorian Clara just makes me wish we got her instead of Moffat doing more mystery box crap. Now we have Riversong. River is a character you either love or despise. With that, I do really like her. While I may seem like a hypocrite since I hated on Ten and Rosa's relationship, here it's a bit more excusable. I'm still not a fan of the Doctor being in a relationship, especially one that is vomit-inducingly flirty and sexual. At least River wasn't ungodly annoying with the Doctor. She was her own character who happened to fall in love with the Doctor. She was still an interesting character on her own and still a capable one. She was cool, kicked ass, and had an intriguing mystery about her that Moffat managed to fuck up like he did with Clara. So, while that is unfortunate, I still find she is a pretty good character who works well with the Doctor and without. She was bred to be a psychopath that killed him, yet managed to fall in love with him. Weird love indeed. Number 1 are Amy and Rory, because of course they are. I know people would separate them, including Moffat, but they are a package fucking deal, goddammit. With Amelia Pond, the Doctor did screw her up a bit, becoming a bit of an angry and bitter adult after leaving her as a child. However, when the Doctor re-enters her life, he reintroduces that idea of whimsy in her life that she desperately needed. That spark of hope, the childlike fantasy that we all need to have close to our hearts. So while she manages to be a fiery redhead, she has her perfect match with Rory Williams. A bit more humble and down-to-earth, he did live in the Doctor's shadow for a long time. Rory is a bit awkward and introverted at first, but Amy realized that he would actually be there for her, unlike the Doctor, and would always protect her and care for her no matter what. Their relationship was explored with the proper amount of depth, and were subjects in great episodes, mainly showcased in Amy's Choice and The Girl Who Waited. They were a perfect match for each other, and worked as one whole unit. Amy was great, Rory was great, hence they are easily the best companions of the 11th Doctor. Now we get to the Doctor and his era. First, let's get into the better part of this, the Doctor himself. I absolutely adore Matt Smith's 11th Doctor because I felt like he was the Doctor at all points during his reign. While he was sometimes goofier than I'd like him to be, I still liked his Doctor because it was an attempt to move on from the Time Warp. It wasn't exactly successful, but we did get a more alien portrayal with the Doctor, somewhat like the 9th Doctor, but even more so, which was definitely a result of his regeneration with how he had so many human relationships with his companions and was a very human portrayal. That destroyed him. He saw that at the end he had an ego and was destroyed by this idea of becoming more human, so he went into the complete opposite direction. And I've discovered that I have liked those portrayals more when it comes to the Doctor. Very alien and clearly cares about humans but looks down upon them. 11 is no exception. While he does have that very goofy exterior, and for the most part it works and isn't incredibly annoying, he still had this part of him that remembered that he tried to not showcase because he wasn't dealing with human feelings anymore. And the way Smith did that was very excellent in my eyes. I also like how he portrayed the madman in a box trope, as well as an old man in a young man's body. He portrayed those two aspects really well and better executed than the 5th Doctor when it comes to the latter. While it did take me a long time to fully appreciate what the 11th Doctor is, I eventually really liked him, and he just became my Doctor. The Doctor that no matter what, you connect with, and that's who 11 is for me. But enough glorifying. Time to move on to the lesser aspect, his era. So this was a complete reverse of the 10th Doctor era, where the first 2 series were good and the last series sucked. Series 5 is definitely the 3rd best series of the show and continues the golden age of New Who, in my opinion, and hell, if it wasn't for series 2 and 3, we would have a complete golden age of the first 5 series, but alas, it was not meant to be. With that though, series 5 is great in my opinion. Series 4 is better, but considering that's an amazing series with a Doctor I don't care for, this is a very good series with a Doctor I really like, so it works. Series 6 is hit and miss. I liked it more than I remember liking it, with a few crap episodes here and there, but for the most part, a pretty good season. Then Series 7 is pretty much crap. You have horrible episodes like Nightmare in Silver and Name of the Doctor, forgettable crap like Crimson Horror and The Bells of St. John, or missed potential like Asylum with the Daleks and Journey to the Center of the Tardis. It's a mess. I think at that point Moffat was busy with Sherlock and didn't give a lot of attention to Doctor Who, and it suffered for it. At least I think. I haven't done a ton of research into that, so if I'm wrong, then it's just Moffat being lazy. While I don't know much when it comes to the 12th Doctor era, I cannot recollect Series 8 for the life of me. I know for the 11th, it started out good and eventually just went downhill with its last season. Honestly, I might do a how to fix video on that. If enough people ask for it. But outside of that, the era had some great attributes and eventually faltered. I do majorly like the tone it's going for with the fairy tale whimsical quality that is very different from the more hardened, character-driven, and grounded tone of the RTD years. Which I appreciate because Moffat could have easily sloppily copied what worked before, but he went and did his own thing, and I liked that tone, and for the most part, it worked. So while the last season sucked, the Doctor through these years managed to still keep a smile on my face throughout. It's not perfect, far from it, but the Doctor helped me power through it. So, that is the 11th Doctor ranked. Lots of ups and downs, but I still have a certain fondness towards this era because Series 6 was the first one I watched on live TV. So at that point, I felt like a real fan. So I'm probably incredibly biased, even though I tried my hardest not to be. I like the era when it manages to be great, and some truly magnificent episodes that I couldn't help but love. Bad towards the end, yes, but I love Matt Smith as the Doctor, and he is most definitely my favorite, if you couldn't tell. Next video is going to be how to fix Infinity War and Endgame in honor of Eternals. Stay tuned.